Chapter 3. Freedom and Responsibility. 3.1 The concept of freedom in existentialism. The concept of freedom lies at the core of existentialist philosophy, forming the foundation upon which existentialists build their understanding of human existence. In existential thought, freedom is not merely a political or social condition, but an intrinsic aspect of human nature. This kind of freedom implies that individuals have the capacity to make choices, unfettered by any deterministic laws of nature or divine will. According to existentialism, each person is thrown into the world, existing before they define themselves, and this existence precedes and grounds their essence. Through this primacy of existence, individuals must navigate the world, making choices that reflect their own essence as they construct it. Jean-Paul Sartre, one of the preeminent existentialist philosophers, emphasizes the significance of freedom by stating that humans are condemned to be free. To Sartre, this means that individuals are responsible for their own actions, and there is no escape from the freedom of choice. Consequently, each person must take ownership of their actions and their consequences. The burden of this kind of freedom is immense, as it removes any possibility of attributing one's life and decisions to external forces. It is upon this tenet of absolute freedom and corresponding responsibility that Sartre posits the concept of bad faith, wherein individuals deceive themselves into thinking they do not possess such freedom to escape the weight of responsibility. However, the existentialist view of freedom is not universally optimistic or empowering. The boundless nature of existential freedom can also lead to feelings of angst or profound existential anxiety. This angst arises from the recognition of the vast array of choices available to an individual, combined with the uncertainty and responsibility tied to those choices. The state of realizing one's absolute freedom can be overwhelming, as it includes the understanding that one's choices define and create the self. Freedom in existentialism is also closely linked to the idea of authenticity. Authenticity involves living in accordance with one's true self, which can only be determined through the exercise of one's freedom. To live authentically, an individual must make choices that align with their genuine values and beliefs, rather than conforming to societal pressures or expectations. This requires a conscientious approach to decision-making, where one constantly evaluates their actions to ensure they are reflective of their true desires and commitments. The intersection of freedom and responsibility in existentialism also touches on the concept of the absurd. The philosopher Albert Camus discusses the absurd as the conflict between humans' search for inherent meaning in life and the silent, indifferent universe that offers no such meaning. This recognition necessitates the individual's ownership of their freedom to find or create meaning through their choices. In embracing the absurd, existentialists advocate for people to take meaningful actions despite the inherent meaninglessness of the world, thus asserting their freedom and defining their own existence. Existential freedom is not without limitations. While individuals can choose their actions, they do not choose the conditions under which they are born or live. Existentialists acknowledge that factors such as history, culture, and personal circumstances constrain an individual's scope of action. Regardless, within these constraints, existentialists contend that individuals still possess the freedom to choose how they will react and define their stance towards the given circumstances. This nuanced understanding recognizes both the limits and the potentials of human freedom. Freedom, then, is not simply about the ability to act, but informs the ethical dimension of existentialism. It establishes a framework within which individuals must consider the moral implications of their choices. Since there is no objective morality provided by an external source, such as religious doctrine or a universal ethical code, existentialists argue that individuals must form their own set of values. By exercising their freedom, individuals define their moral landscape, a process that carries with it great responsibility. This existentialist conception of moral responsibility encourages an active engagement with the world. As individuals exercise their freedom, they shape not only their own essence, but potentially influence the essence and freedom of others. The interconnectedness of individual decisions, underlines the importance of considering the impact of one's actions beyond oneself. Thus, freedom is not an isolated or purely self-interested concept. It has social implications that ripple out into the broader community. Freedom in existential thought is intricately linked to the notion of transcendence. Transcendence, in an existential context, refers to the capacity of individuals to rise above their present circumstances and actualize their potential. Through the exercise of freedom, individuals can transcend the given facts of their existence, such as their past and their environment, to continuously redefine themselves. This represents an ongoing process of self-creation that is central to existentialist philosophy. In conclusion, the concept of freedom within existentialism is complex and multifaceted, encompassing the ability to choose, the inevitability of choice, and the responsibility that comes with that power. It is inseparable from the concepts of authenticity, angst, the absurd, and moral responsibility. Existentialists challenge individuals to confront their inherent freedom bravely, to create meaning in an indifferent universe, and to engage ethically with the world. As existentialism continues to influence contemporary thought, the discourse on freedom becomes ever more crucial, reminding people of the profound depth and breadth of choice that characterizes the human experience. Through an acknowledgement of this freedom, existential thought directs individuals towards a more reflective and intentional existence. 3.2. Responsibility to oneself. Within existentialist thought, the concept of freedom is intrinsically bound to the notion of responsibility. To exist authentically, an individual must recognize and embrace their fundamental freedom to make choices. Concurrently, they must acknowledge the weight of responsibility those choices inevitably carry. This responsibility begins with oneself. It is the duty to act in accordance with one's authentic desires and values rather than external dictates. This section delves into the variegated aspects of this self-responsibility, offering a nuanced examination of what it entails and implies in the context of existentialism. Firstly, responsibility to oneself is grounded in the existentialist understanding of the self as the author of its own values and purpose. Unlike traditional moral structures based on universal principles, existentialism posits that individuals are tasked with creating their own meaning. This self-authorship is a heavy responsibility, as it makes the individual not only the creator of their moral universe, but also the bearer of its consequences. An existentialist recognizes that whatever values one chooses to live by, they must be affirmed actively and repeatedly through one's choices and actions, reflecting an ongoing commitment to those values. Secondly, this responsibility implies a rigorous honesty with oneself. The existentialist must constantly evaluate whether their actions align with their self-determined values and goals. This reflexive evaluation is a form of self-accountability that runs deeper than adherence to external codes of conduct. It involves an intimate scrutiny of motives and intentions. As such, the responsibility to oneself demands a level of self-awareness and courage, as it sometimes necessitates confronting uncomfortable truths about one's own inconsistencies or failures. Thirdly, the concept of bad faith or self-deception is antithetical to the responsibility one has to oneself. In Sartrean existentialism, bad faith represents a denial of one's freedom and responsibility, typically by taking refuge in conformity or in excuses. Assuming responsibility for oneself means actively resisting the temptation of bad faith, even if this is a challenging and uncomfortable process. It requires authenticity, a commitment to confronting the realities of one's situation without resorting to self-delusion or escapism. Fourthly, the existential belief in radical freedom entails that individuals are responsible for their choices regardless of the circumstances. While one's environment and context may influence decisions, existentialism argues that one is never completely determined by external factors. It is always possible, although not always easy, to choose differently and to act in a way that is congruent with one's authentic self. This recognition of pervasive responsibility is both empowering and daunting, as it leaves no room to attribute one's situation solely to outside forces. Fifthly, an individual's relationship with others is also viewed through the lens of self-responsibility. Though one is first and foremost responsible to oneself, existentialism does not advocate for selfishness. Rather, it suggests that through being authentic and responsible for one's own choices, individuals can engage with others more meaningfully. This entails recognizing others' freedom and responsibility, while also upholding one's boundaries and integrity. Sixthly, the responsibility to oneself is not static, it evolves with the individual. As life progresses and experiences accumulate, one's understanding of oneself and one's values might shift. This dynamic aspect of self-responsibility requires adaptability and a willingness to reassess and refine one's choices and commitments. It means being open to growth and acknowledging that who one is today may be different from who one was yesterday, or who one will be tomorrow. Seventhly, embracing responsibility to oneself fosters resilience. When individuals take ownership of their choices, they are better positioned to handle life's adversities. Rather than perceiving themselves as victims of circumstance, existentialists see themselves as agents with the power to navigate their existence. This does not imply that suffering can always be avoided, but rather that individuals have the capacity to respond to suffering with agency. Eighthly, the responsibility to oneself also entails recognizing the limits of one's control. While existentialists maintain that individuals have a tremendous scope of freedom, they also acknowledge that complete control over life events is impossible. However, one can control their reactions to the uncontrollable. This balance between recognizing limits and exercising freedom is an intricate part of self-responsibility, ensuring that individuals do not tilt into either resignation or omnipotence fantasies. Ninthly, the existential responsibility to oneself is a source of existential anxiety. The freedom to choose and the burden of creating one's own values can lead to a feeling of vertigo due to the absence of objective measures for guidance. Nevertheless, this anxiety is not debilitating, but rather a sign of full engagement with the responsibility of freedom. It is through this anxiety that individuals realize the stakes of their existence and are spurred to act authentically. Finally, responsibility to oneself is an ongoing process that can never be fully completed. It is a lifelong endeavor requiring vigilance, effort, and self-compassion. Mistakes are an inevitable part of this process, and learning from them is integral. A meaningful existential life is not one devoid of errors, but one lived with the continual effort to align one's actions with a self-carved ethical compass, accepting and embracing the totality of one's freedom and responsibility. 3.3 The burden of freedom. In discussing freedom within an existentialist framework, we must acknowledge the weight that freedom imposes on the individual. The notion of freedom is central to existentialism. The philosophy asserts that individuals are free to make their own choices and define their own lives. Unlike deterministic or fatalistic paradigms, where the trajectory of life is seen as preordained or subject to forces beyond one's control, existentialism posits that individuals are the architects of their existence. However, this freedom is not without its burdens, for with the power to choose comes the responsibility for those choices and their consequences. Freedom, in the existential sense, goes beyond mere political or social liberty. It is an ontological condition of being human. To exist is to be free, meaning that with every moment of existence, one is confronted by the necessity of choice. Every action, belief, and aspect of one's personality is a result of choice, either actively made or passively allowed to happen through inaction. This constant need to choose can be overwhelming, as it defies the comfort of attributing one's situation to fate, society, or a deity. For the existentialist, there are no excuses, we are each responsible for who we become. This freedom extends to creating and finding meaning in one's life. Since existentialism suggests that life does not have inherent meaning, it becomes one's personal task to construct that meaning. There is a profound burden here, as the responsibility for meaning-making is entirely on the individual. This is often a solitary endeavor, for while one can take guidance from others, ultimately meaning in life is unique and personal. The anxiety often associated with this aspect of freedom is termed existential angst, which arises from the understanding that one has to navigate and negotiate the world without any predetermined guideposts. The burden of freedom also entails an acknowledgement of the impermanence and ultimate mortality of human life. Alongside the daily choices, the individual must contend with the knowledge that life is finite, and that the freedom to choose is bounded by this finitude. This sobering realization can lead to what is known as existential dread, a deep and sometimes paralyzing fear regarding the inherent meaninglessness of life. Yet this dread also serves as a motivation to use one's freedom meaningfully and authentically, as there are no second chances in a finite life. The responsibility inherent in existential freedom precludes inauthenticity, defined as failing to accept the responsibility of one's freedom by living according to the dictates of others. Inauthentic living is often easier, as it involves conforming to societal norms and expectations, thereby escaping the anxiety that comes with making individual choices. But in doing so, one abandons the pursuit of personal authenticity. Authentic existence, on the other hand, is a conscious embrace of freedom and the burden it carries, with an acceptance of responsibility for one's own life. Interpersonal relationships pose another realm where the burden of freedom is evident. Each individual, in being free, must also acknowledge the freedom of others, which existentialists argue is a source of complexity and joy, as well as conflict and tension in human interactions. Respecting the freedom of the other requires the constant negotiation of one's own desires and values with those of another person. It necessitates a degree of vulnerability, as engaging authentically with others means revealing one's own freely made choices and respecting those of others. Furthermore, the concept of bad faith, a term coined by Jean-Paul Sartre, illustrates a typical response to the burden of freedom. Bad faith is the denial of one's freedom by shifting responsibility onto external factors, a refusal to own up to the fact that we are the creators of our essence through the choices we make. Sartre posits that bad faith is a form of self-deception, a mental gymnastics that people perform to avoid the anxiety associated with their radical freedom and responsibility. The law and societal systems also reflect an understanding of personal freedom and its corollary, responsibility. The judicial systems are founded on the presumption that individuals are free agents capable of choosing between right and wrong. When a person commits a crime, that person is held responsible because he or she could have chosen differently. Therefore, on a societal level, the individual's burden of freedom assumes a legal dimension where each person must be aware of the broader implications of their free choices. In practice, dealing with the burden of freedom is an evolving process that involves self-awareness, acceptance, and courage. Through introspection, individuals must strive to understand their own desires and motives. Acceptance involves coming to terms with the confines of their freedom, such as the limitations set by society, their own abilities, and temporal bounds. Courage is required to continuously make choices, despite the uncertainty and responsibility they entail. Finally, it is crucial to acknowledge the positive aspects of the burden of freedom. It is precisely this burden that allows for the development of a robust sense of self, the pursuit of passion, the creation of deep relationships, and the etching of a personal legacy. The weight of freedom pushes individuals to live fully, authentically, and to take ownership of their narrative, ensuring a life rich with personal significance, despite the inherent struggles it may bring. The existentialist view thus places the onus on each person to not only bear the burden, but to also draw strength and purpose from it. 3.4 Social Responsibility. As we continue to delve into the tenets of existentialism, it is imperative to address the concept of social responsibility and its role in an existential framework. Social responsibility refers to the ethical theory that individuals have a duty to act for the benefit of society at large. Within existential thought, social responsibility takes on a unique dimension given the emphasis on individual freedom and the inherent responsibility that comes with it. Existentialism posits that freedom is not merely the ability to choose among alternatives, but also encompasses the responsibility for those choices and their impact on oneself and the world. The assertion of existentialism is that freedom implies that every action a person takes shapes their essence. It follows, then, that a person's actions towards society are a reflection and a construction of their character. This character is not predetermined, but is continuously forged through choices and interactions. The social realm thus becomes a canvas upon which individuals paint the portrait of their identity. The importance of this stance cannot be overstated, as it places the burden of crafting a beneficial social environment squarely on the shoulders of each individual. When examining social responsibility through the lens of existentialism, it becomes clear that social structures and institutions are influenced and upheld by the individual's participatory actions or inactions. Individuals cannot disentangle themselves from the social fabric. Their existence is inherently bound to the collective. Therefore, each decision made is a contribution to the construction of the social reality. In recognizing this interconnectedness, existentialism asserts that one bears responsibility not only for oneself, but also for the way one's actions contribute to the social order. This perspective stands in sharp contrast to deterministic views, which might argue that social phenomena are governed by external forces beyond the control of individuals. To the contrary, existentialism enables the view that every individual plays a part in shaping society. This suggests a democratic approach to existence, where the collective is not merely an abstract concept, but a tangible entity dynamically shaped by the individual contributions of each of its members. Accepting this, it becomes a moral imperative for individuals to consider the societal implications of their actions. Consider the idea of freedom within a society. While individual freedom is exalted, it is always exercised within a context of social norms and laws designed to ensure the collective good. Thus, the exercise of freedom is a negotiation between individual desires and social constraints. Acting responsibly in this context means recognizing and respecting the delicate balance between personal liberty and the well-being of others. It requires a conscientious approach to decision-making that takes into account how one's actions reverberate within the larger community. Furthermore, social responsibility in existentialism also extends to acts of omission. Choosing to remain passive in the face of societal issues is, in itself, an active choice that carries moral weight. Inaction, just like action, shapes the individual's essence. Thereby, existentialism challenges people to engage actively with societal issues rather than receding into passivity or complacency. This engagement does not necessitate grand gestures, but can manifest in everyday decisions that align with the betterment of society. The concept of bad faith, a term coined by Jean-Paul Sartre, is important when discussing social responsibility. It describes the tendency of individuals to deny their freedom and responsibility by attributing their situation to external causes. Within social contexts, claiming powerlessness or feigning ignorance to avoid taking action is an example of bad faith. Engaging with social responsibility counters this tendency, as it requires acknowledging the power and influence one holds in shaping societal norms and values. By emphasizing an individual's impact on society, existentialism also paves the way for discussions on equity and justice. If every person is responsible for societal dynamics, then issues of inequality and injustice become the responsibility of each community member. The existentialist perspective calls for proactive engagement in tackling these issues and advocates for personal accountability in promoting a more equitable society. In terms of its practical applications, social responsibility can be seen in the choices individuals make in their professional lives, consumer habits, and civic engagement. The professional choices one makes, for instance, can endorse ethical practices and contribute positively to the community. Similarly, in consumption, the decision to support sustainable and fair trade products reflects a commitment to social responsibility. Civic engagement, such as voting, volunteering, or participating in community dialogues, also exemplifies the existential commitment to collective well-being. Finally, the existentialist approach to social responsibility serves as a reminder that social change is often a cumulative result of individual choices. Each person's endeavors towards social responsibility, no matter how seemingly insignificant, contribute to broader societal progress. This view not only empowers individuals to take ownership of their role in society, but also fosters a sense of solidarity, understanding that collective well-being is dependent on the conscious actions of every member. Within existentialism, social responsibility is an inextricable part of human freedom. While acknowledging individual autonomy, existential philosophy also upholds the fact that with freedom comes the weighty requirement to act with consideration for societal impact. This dual conception of freedom and responsibility encapsulates the existential mandate for individuals to consciously engage with the world and to understand their part in both shaping and being shaped by the society in which they live. Section 3.5 Moral Ambiguity. The concept of moral ambiguity is integral to existentialist thought. It refers to situations in which the moral correctness of actions or decisions is unclear, complex, or problematic. From an existential perspective, the universe does not possess inherent ethical truths, which means that individuals must navigate a world without absolute moral guidelines. This lack of definitive moral direction underscores the responsibility of the individual in shaping their own ethical framework. Existentialists argue that one must confront moral ambiguity without the expectation of finding clear and comforting answers. Existentialism posits that individuals are free to make choices and are responsible for the outcomes of those choices. However, this freedom is often exercised within the context of ambiguous moral situations. When faced with moral ambiguity, the onus is on the individual to deliberate, decide, and act, knowing that objective rightness may be elusive. This necessity to choose without the assurance of moral certainty can lead to a sense of profound responsibility, a central theme in existentialism. It challenges individuals to accept the weight of their decisions and the inevitable uncertainty that accompanies them. Moral ambiguity also reflects the complexity of human interactions and societal structures. It compels the recognition that moral issues are seldom black and white. They often involve a multitude of factors, including intentions, consequences, and the diverse perspectives of those affected. Consequently, existentialists maintain that individuals must constantly engage in ethical deliberation, considering the multifaceted ramifications of their actions. This relentless examination is exhaustive, yet it is considered by existentialists as a fundamental aspect of an authentic existence. The absence of universal moral laws in existentialism does not imply that anything goes. On the contrary, because individuals are seen as the authors of values, they are tasked with the heavy responsibility of creating ethical structures that they and others can live by. This creates a paradox where freedom of choice coexists with the responsibility of crafting a moral compass. The existentialist wrestles with this tension, striving to make ethical decisions while knowing that their choices will inevitably be subject to scrutiny and reinterpretation. Existentialism's acknowledgement of moral ambiguity often leads to the consideration of context in ethical decision-making. Since existentialists reject the notion of fixed moral truths, the particulars of every situation are pertinent. There is a recognition that what might be considered a morally justified act in one context may not hold the same moral weight in another. This situational approach to ethics places even greater emphasis on individual judgment and the necessity for continual reassessment of one's moral stance. An implication of moral ambiguity within existentialism is the rejection of moral absolutism. The existentialist does not accept the concept that moral standards are universally applicable, regardless of circumstance. This viewpoint contrasts sharply with moral absolutist perspectives that espouse unchanging and universally binding moral principles. Instead, existentialists embrace moral relativism to some degree, allowing for a spectrum of moral responses that vary according to the intricacies of each specific case. The encounter with moral ambiguity fosters existential anxiety or angst. This existential angst arises from the realization that one's choices are unfounded in any objective morality, and that one must bear the full weight of their outcomes. The notion that we are condemned to choose, as famously asserted by Jean-Paul Sartre, becomes particularly poignant when decisions lack clear-cut moral direction. This angst is not viewed necessarily as a negative emotion, but rather as a catalyst for authentic living and self-awareness. It propels individuals to confront their freedom and encourages vigilance in their ethical pursuits. Moral ambiguity also raises questions about the role of societal norms and laws in shaping individual ethics. Although existentialists contend that individuals must create their own values, they also acknowledge that societal expectations exert considerable influence. The interplay between personal freedom and societal constraints highlights the difficulties individuals face in determining their own morals. When societal norms are at odds with personal values, the existentialist must navigate the complex process of aligning their actions with their individual ethics, which may necessitate resisting collective pressures. This resistance is not without consequence. Moral ambiguity inherently involves risk, as individuals must act with the understanding that their choices might conflict with the expectations of others or with accepted norms. In navigating this risk, existentialists may seek to cultivate virtues such as courage and integrity, traits that equip individuals to act according to their self-determined principles, even in the face of opposition or misunderstanding. By fostering these virtues, individuals can better confront moral ambiguity and live in alignment with their personal ethical commitments. Moral ambiguity is a persistent reality within existentialism that highlights the tension between freedom and responsibility. It compels individuals to grapple with the complexities of ethical decision-making in the absence of absolute moral standards. The existentialist embraces this ambiguity, viewing it as an essential part of the human condition that demands personal engagement, accountability, and the courage to affirm one's own values amidst the uncertainty. As such, existentialism challenges us to confront moral ambiguity directly, crafting our own ethical paths with purpose and determination. 3.6 The role of action. Existential philosophy emphasizes the centrality of action in human existence. Actions constitute the basis through which individuals express their being and assert themselves in the world. In this context, an individual's actions are not merely physical movements or mechanical reactions, they are laden with intentionality and consciousness. Each action reflects a choice, a selection from a multitude of possibilities that an individual faces at any given moment. As such, action becomes a definitive element of personal freedom, solidifying the idea that one is free to choose, but is also responsible for those choices. The existential perspective asserts that human beings are not defined by predetermined essences or attributes. Instead, we are largely defined by our actions. What one chooses to do or to abstain from doing tells more about that individual's identity than any fixed set of characteristics. When an individual acts, they are asserting their existence and shaping their essence. Since existence precedes essence, as noted by philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, an individual continuously defines themselves through their actions, sculpting their identity over time. This process is dynamic and ongoing, highlighting the importance of constant reflection on one's actions to align with their chosen values and goals. Moreover, existentialism posits that individuals are not only responsible for their own actions, but also for their inaction. Refraining from acting is itself an action, carrying consequences just as tangible as any active decision. By not acting, one may be indirectly supporting the status quo or allowing certain outcomes to unfold. This underscores the existential principle that individuals cannot escape the weight of responsibility that accompanies their freedom. Human beings are thus not only architects of their own lives, but also contributors to the lives of others and to the world's condition, whether through direct action or through the lack thereof. The implications of actions in terms of freedom and responsibility are profound. The exercise of freedom is actualized in the moment of choice that leads to action. This moment encapsulates the individual's existential freedom, the boundless potential to forge a unique path. However, in recognizing one's freedom, one must also acknowledge the inherent responsibility, the moral and ethical dimensions of actions. Individuals must consider the potential impact of their choices, not only on themselves but also on others. This inherent responsibility means that ethical considerations become paramount in the realm of action. The existentialist view suggests that actions cannot be morally neutral. Every decision carries an ethical weight that one must bear. Therefore, the call to act is not just a call to assert freedom, but also a call to engage in morally and ethically sound behavior. It is thus incumbent upon individuals to ascertain the moral implications of their choices and to strive to act in accordance with their personal ethical framework. Existentialists also argue that one's authenticity is inextricably linked to the role of action. To be authentic is to act in accordance with one's self-determined values and beliefs, free from the dictates of external forces such as societal norms, tradition, or authority. Authentic action is self-directed and reflective of the true self, free from the veneer of conformity or the influence of what existentialists call the other. This does not mean that one should disregard the existence or rights of others, but instead should navigate the balance between asserting one's individuality and being part of a larger community. In the face of life's inherent absurdity, as characterized by philosopher Albert Camus, actions take on a defiant quality. To act in a world perceived as devoid of inherent meaning is to rebel against nihilism, to seek to create meaning through one's endeavors. Thus, action is a form of resistance against the encroachment of meaninglessness, an affirmation of one's capacity to find or create purpose. This suggests that action is not a mere byproduct of being, but a conscious assertion of the human spirit striving to transcend the limitations imposed by a seemingly indifferent universe. The role of action in an existential framework acknowledges that the underlying motivations for action are complex and multi-layered. Actions typically do not stem from a single cause, but rather from an amalgamation of influences, including past experiences, emotions, beliefs, desires, and the perceived reality of the situation. Individuals, thus, are continually interpreting and reinterpreting the world around them, adjusting their actions accordingly. This constant interpretive activity highlights the fluid nature of existence and the adaptability required to navigate it effectively. Furthermore, the consequences of actions are not always predictable. Despite an individual's intentions and considerations, the outcomes of actions can diverge from the expected. This uncertainty introduces the concept of risk in the exercise of freedom. Individuals must make choices without guarantees of success or desirable outcomes. This risk, inherent in the freedom to act, also heightens the sense of responsibility inherent in existential choice. One must be prepared to accept and learn from the unforeseen consequences of one's actions, incorporating them into the ongoing narrative of one's existential journey. Lastly, existentialism highlights the social and historical context in which actions occur. An individual's actions are neither isolated nor without context. They happen within a web of relationships and a tapestry of historical circumstances. This relational and historical embeddedness means that while actions are personal, they are also interconnected with the actions of others and influenced by the social and historical currents of the time. Recognizing this interconnectedness, existential thinkers urge individuals to consider the wider implications of their actions, understanding that each decision contributes to the shaping of society and history. In summary, the role of action within existential philosophy is fundamental to understanding the nature of human freedom and responsibility. Actions are the expressions through which individuals assert their existence, make ethical choices, pursue authenticity, defy absurdity, interpret the world, take risks, and engage with the socio-historical context. Through action, existentialism argues, individuals continually shape their being and participate in the unfolding narrative of human existence. 3.7 Commitment and Engagement. Commitment and engagement are key concepts in existentialist thought. Central to understanding these terms within existentialism is recognizing their relationship to individual freedom and responsibility. Commitment, in existential terms, refers to the act of choosing a particular course of action or set of beliefs and dedicating oneself to it, despite the absence of any absolute or external justification for that choice. This reflects the existentialist tenet that essence follows existence, meaning that an individual's essence or nature is not predetermined but is shaped by their actions and choices. Engagement complements commitment, as it pertains to the way an individual interacts with the world and immerses themselves in their chosen path. It is a full and active participation in life, often involving social and political aspects as well as personal choices. Engagement in an existentialist context also implies an acceptance of the consequences of one's actions and choices, further reinforcing the weight of personal responsibility in shaping one's essence. The sense of freedom in existential thought arises from the belief that individuals are free to choose their own paths. This freedom, however, is not without weight. It comes with the burden of responsibility. Once freed from deterministic constraints, an individual must take full ownership of their actions and their outcomes, good or bad. In this view, to commit is to exercise one's freedom, while also acknowledging and accepting the responsibility that goes with it. Commitment, as per existentialism, is a deeply personal act. It is not to be confused with a mere acquiescence to societal norms or expectations. Instead, it is the conscious decision to adhere to a set of values or engage in a course of action that one has personally deemed important or meaningful. As such, it is an expression of authenticity, a fundamental concept in existentialism that refers to living in accordance with one's true self, values, and beliefs. When an individual commits to a cause or a lifestyle, they are anchoring their existence in the chosen commitment, which becomes a source of identity and purpose. The existentialist perspective holds that without such self-imposed commitments, life can seem arbitrary or meaningless. The act of committing imbues life with meaning, a meaning that is not innate or discovered, but rather created through the act of commitment itself. This creation of meaning through commitment has implications for how one interacts with others. Engagement frequently means a direct involvement in social and political matters, bringing one's personal commitments to bear on the broader community. It posits that individual actions can and do have a larger impact, thereby linking personal responsibility to societal responsibility. An engaged individual does not live in isolation. Their choices resonate within the larger web of human relationships and community. The consciousness of death also plays a pivotal role in one's commitment and engagement. Existentialism contends that an acute awareness of mortality can lead to a more authentic way of living, as one realizes that life is finite and opportunities for choice and action are limited. This awareness can act as a catalyst, driving individuals towards deeper commitment and engagement, urging them to live in the present and shape their lives actively, rather than defer to the whims of fate or passivity. This relationship between commitment, engagement, and mortality is articulated in existentialism as a call to live resolutely. To live resolutely is to live consciously and deliberately in the face of life's uncertainties and the inevitability of death. It is to affirm one's freedom and responsibility by making decisive commitments and engaging fully with life's possibilities, rather than shrinking from them. The notion of bad faith is relevant here as the antithesis of commitment and engagement. Bad faith is the denial of one's freedom and responsibility by attributing one's choices and circumstances to external forces, whether societal, biological, or metaphysical. It is a form of self-deception, where an individual refuses to acknowledge their role in creating the conditions of their existence. The concept of bad faith underscores the idea that committing and engaging are essential for leading an authentic life, one that is true to oneself and one's capabilities. Despite the centrality of commitment and engagement in existential thought, the process of committing is not perceived as absolute or permanent. Existentialists acknowledge that people evolve, and that commitments might change as individuals gain new insights and experiences. However, this change must come from a place of thoughtful deliberation, rather than capriciousness or evasion of responsibility. Consequently, commitment and engagement are part of an ongoing process of self-creation and existential discovery, reflecting the fluid nature of existence and the continual need to reaffirm one's values and choices through action. Commitment and engagement in existentialism embody the assertion of individual freedom and responsibility. They represent the conscious decision to pursue a chosen path, fully aware of the inherent absence of predetermined meaning in life. Through commitment, an individual creates purpose, while through engagement, they express and enact that purpose in the world. These concepts highlight the importance of living authentically and resolutely in the face of life's uncertainties, advocating an active, deliberate, and personal approach to existence. 3.8 Existentialist view on free will. Existentialism asserts that human beings are essentially free, not bound by deterministic forces such as divine will, scientific causality, or social conditioning. Free will, within the existentialist framework, is viewed as the defining characteristic of human existence. The philosophy contends that individuals create values and meaning in an indifferent and inherently meaningless universe through their actions and choices. Unlike deterministic worldviews that ascribe human behaviors to external causes, existentialism places the responsibility for actions squarely on individuals' own shoulders. The existentialist perspective on free will starkly emphasizes personal autonomy and responsibility. According to this viewpoint, individuals always have a choice, and the denial of this freedom is a form of self-deception known as bad faith. The concept of bad faith illustrates an attempt to flee from the overwhelming responsibility that comes with unfettered freedom, leading individuals to ascribe their life situation to factors beyond their control. This self-deception is rejected by existentialist thought, which argues that even in predetermined structures, individuals are free to make choices that reflect their authentic selves. Jean-Paul Sartre, one of existentialism's foremost figures, argued that humans are condemned to be free, meaning that the absence of any predetermined essence compels humans to define themselves through action. For Sartre, freedom is inextricably linked with existence as we continuously fashion and refashion our essence through choices and actions. This continual process defines existential freedom, which is not simply the ability to choose, but also encompasses our capacity to understand the consequences of our choices and to take ownership of them. Moreover, existentialists maintain that free will engenders an innate anxiety, often termed existential angst. This anxiety stems from the realization of one's absolute freedom and the weight of responsibility it brings. It is the dread associated with understanding that one's decisions are not just shaping the individual's existence, but also potentially influencing the world. Faced with infinite possibilities and the absence of objective standards to guide decision-making, the individual confronts the intense pressure of shaping their destiny. Despite the acknowledgement of this inherent anxiety, existentialism does not consider it a proverbial curse, but instead as a stimulant for intentional living. The awareness of freedom and the resultant angst can lead to a more authentic and purposeful life. By embracing anxiety as a condition of human existence, individuals may be compelled to act with greater deliberateness, in alignment with their chosen values and beliefs, rather than as a passive response to external circumstances. Existentialism also refutes the notion that free will is an illusion caused by ignorance of the causes influencing one's behavior. It contests that while there are certainly factors that affect choices, the capability to transcend these influences through conscious decision-making remains intact. This refutation extends to a criticism of psychological, social, and biological determinism, which can often be perceived as diminishing personal agency and absolving individuals of responsibility for their actions. This philosophical approach demands intense personal reflection, as it necessitates that individuals seek a deep understanding of their motives and the implications of their choices. The existentialist view of free will calls for an honest acknowledgement of one's freedom, as well as a willingness to confront the ethical dimensions of decisions. Personal decisions are not seen as isolated instances, but as fundamental to the individual's ongoing project of self-creation. In evaluating the choices people make, existentialism posits that individuals must also consider their relations with others. Free will is not merely an individualistic endeavor, it extends into the realm of social existence. The freedom of the individual must be reconciled with the freedom of others, introducing an ethical component to the existentialist understanding of free will. This suggests that while individuals are free to choose, their choices should be made with awareness of the potential impact on the freedom and well-being of others. Furthermore, the existentialist view points out that even in situations where freedom seems severely constrained by external circumstances, such as political oppression or economic hardship, the concept of free will remains relevant. Even in the face of limited choices, the existentialist philosophy believes that individuals retain the freedom to determine their stance toward these situations and to find ways of expressing personal freedom within, or in spite of, their confines. Conclusively, the existentialist perspective on free will is one that is intertwined with personal responsibility and the intrinsic search for meaning. In an existence devoid of absolutes, existentialism empowers individuals to pioneer their own paths, proposing that, despite the uncertainties and responsibilities that accompany such freedom, it remains the fundamental element in the development of a truly authentic life. It is the relentless assertion of free will against any form of constraint, be it societal, psychological, or existential, that carves out the arena for existentialism's most profound truth. We are the architects of our essence, and our existence is contingent on the exercise of our inherent freedom. 3.9 The Ethics of Ambiguity. In the context of existentialist philosophy, the notion of ambiguity refers to the complexity and inherent contradictions within human existence. It suggests that human life cannot be fully understood through rational or systematic thought alone, as it encompasses a wide range of experiences, emotions, and perspectives that often evade precise definition. Particularly influential in the development of this concept was the French philosopher Simone de Beauvoir, in her work, The Ethics of Ambiguity. Her work emphasizes that ambiguity is an essential character of human existence, and it must be acknowledged to live authentically and ethically. The starting point for the ethics of ambiguity is the assertion that human existence is characterized by a freedom that is both liberating and daunting. According to de Beauvoir, humans are condemned to be free. They are thrown into existence without a fixed essence and faced with the necessity to construct their own essence through action. This freedom leads to ambiguity, because it is not clear what the right choices are or what values to uphold. This realization can be unsettling since it places the full burden of shaping one's identity and destiny squarely on the individual. In The Acceptance of Ambiguity, de Beauvoir argues that individuals must recognize the limits of their freedom. While one is free to make choices, these choices are made within a context of existing conditions and forces such as social structures and historical circumstances, which cannot be fully controlled or predicted. Furthermore, choices inevitably affect others because human beings are not isolated entities. We exist within a network of relationships, and our freedom is interdependent with the freedom of others. This interconnectedness introduces complexities that further entangle ethical decision-making. De Beauvoir's notion of ethics arises from this framework of ambiguity. Without predetermined guidelines or universal moral codes to follow, every individual must navigate the murky waters of ethical dilemmas on their own. However, de Beauvoir does not suggest that this leads to a moral relativism where anything goes. Instead, she proposes that the responsibility inherent in our freedom calls for a commitment to an ongoing project of seeking justice and freedom for oneself and others. This implies a continuous effort to respect the freedom and subjectivity of others, while also standing up against oppression and exploitation. This responsibility also extends to the self. An individual must constantly strive to live authentically, which means acknowledging and embracing their freedom instead of denying it. Denial, in the forms of what de Beauvoir terms as seriousness, submissiveness, or passion, leads to bad faith, a concept which is central in existentialism. Bad faith is the refusal to confront the reality of your own freedom and the choices that it necessitates. This denial is unethical because it suppresses the individual's potential for self-determination and the ability to contribute meaningfully to the liberation of others. The state of ambiguity can give rise to angst, a profound existential anxiety. This angst arises because individuals must make choices without certainty of their outcomes or their moral righteousness. De Beauvoir maintains that this angst is not an obstacle to action, but a necessary condition of it. Acknowledging angst leads to a more profound understanding of the weight of our decisions and the impact they have on the world. This understanding prompts a deliberate and considered approach to action, which is central to ethical behavior. Engagement in the world necessarily means that one also engages in the struggle for liberty and justice. De Beauvoir points out that oppression dehumanizes not only the oppressed, but also the oppressor. Ethical living, therefore, involves fighting against situations and structures that curtail the essential freedom that is part of human existence. De Beauvoir stresses the importance of solidarity in this struggle, advocating for a collective effort to improve the human condition. This fosters a world that allows for a greater expression of freedom for all individuals. The ethics of ambiguity, thus, resolves to a call for action, despite existential uncertainty. It constitutes an imperative to create meaning through commitment to ourselves and our intertwined human reality. Ethical behavior comes from the conscious endeavor to create situations that enhance collective freedom and foster an environment where individuals can define themselves authentically. This is an arduous task, as it entails constant vigilance, self-reflection, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about our freedom and our responsibilities. Understanding that life's complexities cannot be boiled down to absolutes, the ethics of ambiguity counsels embracing the nuanced nature of ethical decision-making. It places profound importance on context, acknowledging that what is considered ethical in one situation may not be so in another. Choices are made within a web of interrelations, and ethical actions thus hinge on careful consideration of specific circumstances. Leading an ethical life from this perspective entails a commitment to continuous learning, open-mindedness, and flexibility. Finally, de Beauvoir's ethical framework emphasizes the importance of hope. Despite the uncertainties and the constraints on our freedom, hope is seen as a driving force for ethical action. Hope allows individuals to envision a world of expanded freedom and to work towards it against the odds. It inspires resilience and fosters a spirit of endurance that is necessary to deal with life's inherent ambiguities, responsible, ethical living. In learning to navigate life's ambiguities with purpose and conscience, individuals can actively participate in shaping a world that reflects the existential ideals of freedom, respect, and justice. 3.10. Political implications of freedom. The concept of freedom is deeply embedded in existentialist thought. It posits that individuals are fundamentally free to make choices and are responsible for the consequences of those choices. This idea extends to the political realm, influencing notions of governance, rights, and societal organization. Existentialist philosophy makes the case for political systems that maximize individual liberty and require citizens to take responsibility for their political and social environments. In a practical sense, the political implications of the existentialist notion of freedom suggest a system that provides both the space for individual choices and the structures that encourage responsible decision-making. Such political systems may refrain from imposing excessive restrictions on personal behavior, provided that these actions do not infringe upon the freedoms of others. In existentialist terms, a just political system empowers its citizens to craft their own essence through their actions and choices while recognizing the collective dimension of human existence. Conversely, totalitarian systems which suppress individual freedoms and prescribe a particular mode of existence are fundamentally at odds with existentialist principles. In these systems, individuals are treated as means to an end, frequently stripped of their autonomy and subjected to a broadly defined greater good that erases personal choice. Existentialism emphasizes the dangers of dehumanization in such contexts, advocating instead for political arrangements that elevate and preserve human dignity and autonomy. Democratic societies tend to align more closely with existentialist values, offering a framework within which individuals can participate in the shaping of their communities and government. Voting, assembly, and freedom of speech are seen as essential tools for individuals to express their will and impact their collective existence. However, existentialism also acknowledges that the mere existence of democratic institutions is not a guarantee against the commodification of individuality or the alienation of citizens. Existentialism suggests that political freedom cannot be passively received, it must be actively engaged with. Alongside the privilege of freedom comes the burden of active participation and the moral imperative to shape society in responsible ways. Passive acquiescence to the conditions of one's existence is antithetical to existentialist thought, which urges individuals to recognize and embrace their role in co-creating their political reality. Freedom, as proposed by existentialists, is inextricably linked to ethics. Each individual's choices influence and shape the lives of others, making ethical considerations an integral aspect of decision-making processes. Politically, this translates into policies and actions that consider the wider community and future generations. Political leaders and individuals alike are held to standards that assume the interconnectivity of human actions and their long-term implications. One of the critical challenges in operationalizing existentialist freedom in politics is the balance between individual liberty and social responsibility. Societies must navigate between the anarchy of absolute freedom without responsibility and the oppression of rigid control. A political instantiation of existentialist philosophy would attempt to harmonize personal autonomy with collective well-being, acknowledging that the freedom of each person is bound by the context of everyone else's freedom. Given its emphasis on personal responsibility, existentialism also provides a lens through which to examine the socioeconomic structures that constrain individual freedom. It questions whether a system that engenders significant inequalities can truly be said to promote freedom. If economic or social barriers limit an individual's capacity to make meaningful choices, existentialism would argue that such a system falls short of its ideal, necessitating reform or reconstruction. Furthermore, the global ramifications of freedom imply an international dimension to existentialist political thought. Globalization has interlinked the fates of people across borders, and existentialism would encourage nations and individuals to consider their responsibility to the global community. Policies and actions are therefore to be judged not only by their domestic impact, but also by their international implications, stressing an ethic of care and responsibility that transcends national boundaries. The existentialist perspective on freedom carries profound political implications. It demands systems of governance that facilitate personal autonomy, necessitates active engagement in political processes, and requires the integration of an ethical framework that prioritizes human dignity. While there are challenges in realizing these principles in practice, they offer a valuable lens for rethinking the foundation and organization of political communities, highlighting the perpetual need to balance individual liberty with the common good.